John chapter 14. Whoa, all of a sudden I got a little ringing. John chapter 14. Really, we left off verse 3. If you remember, we were talking about my Father's house and how it's not necessarily many mansions, but more that it was dwelling places or rooms, depending on the translation. That Jesus is more than likely referring to the temple that was built. And I gave some verses referencing these apartments or living quarters, these chambers or rooms, again, depending on the translation, for evidence of this. And then it's kind of where we left off. Did anybody have anything to add from last week or to what we discussed last week? Okay. So Jesus, in speaking these words to them, verses 1 through 3, do not let your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself. That's where I am. There you may be also. So Jesus spoke these words to his disciples on the evening prior to his crucifixion. And they were, the apostles, the disciples, they were without a doubt anxious about what was going on. A little bit confused and possibly, I'm sure, discouraged. Jesus had told them, and I'll give you the reference for these. Jesus had told them, first of all, that he was going away. There in John 13 and verse 33. He told them in John 12, verses 32 and 33, that he was going to be killed. And he said in John 13 and verse 21 that one of the 12 would betray him, and that Peter would deny him 3 times in verse 38 there, and that they would be scattered after his arrest. That's Matthew 26, verse 31. So there's a little bit of confusion going on here. He says all of these things. I'm going away. I'm going to be killed. One of you's going to betray me. You're Peter. You're going to deny me 3 times. And after this happens, you're all going to be scattered. So there's a lot of anxiety that's happening on this eve. But the purpose of Christ's comments wasn't to make them anxious or to depress them. It was really to encourage them about the responsibilities that he had in store for them. He says, let not your heart be troubled. There in verse 1. He was going away to make preparations for them, and he would return then to receive the disciples to himself. Now, as for referencing the temple and its many mansions, the refurbishing of the second temple, also called Herod's temple in Jerusalem, it was the premier building project that people were talking about all the time. There's a Facebook group for Grand Prairie, and people are always on there. Hey, what are they building over here? What are they building, on this corner? What? Kind of the same thing. It was the building project that everybody was talking about. And only a short time earlier, the disciples had visited the buildings actually in the temple and seen these massive stones that were used for that. Over in Mark 13, for example, in verse 1, Mark 13 in verse 1, and as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples saith unto him, Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. And you might also write down Matthew 24 and verse 1. Matthew 24 and verse 1, essentially the same thing there. And Jesus went out, departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. So they had just seen these massive stones that were used to build the temple. And with that visit to the temple freshly in their minds, Jesus likens it to these dwelling places or these rooms in the physical temple to the responsibilities and positions of leadership that his faithful followers would be given in the kingdom, right? In my Father's house, in my Father's temple, there are many rooms or many dwelling places. And we talked last week about these were chambers often for supplies and for the priests. And what are we, as Peter writes, but a royal priesthood, a holy nation? And where is it that priests reside but within the temple? So Jesus is saying, in my Father's temple, in my Father's kingdom, there is a place for each one of you. There is a role for each one of you to play. Really, in short, Jesus, he was encouraging his disciples that they're going to have responsibilities in his Father's kingdom, and he is preparing them so that they would be able to receive this. If you remember the Sunday morning sermon, we were talking about Peter, is that there was a point where he wasn't where he needed to be at just yet. And we even talked about it in this class about how he thought his faith was over here, and yet he was going to deny Christ. So he was constantly needing to be prepared. And Christ is saying, look, I am preparing this place for you. And the implications of the teaching are important for us as well. Now, why do we think that what he's saying here, in my Father's house, are many dwelling places or many rooms? Why do we think that's important for us when we look at it in the context of having a role? Any thoughts?
Well, if they have a role, then we'll have a role. We're the same as they.
And yeah, it doesn't. Oh, go ahead. Were you? Oh, I thought you were. No, absolutely. Is that, so we have to remember the apostles, they were inspired men, but they were still just men. They had a role to play in God's kingdom, just like we have a role to play. And it doesn't matter how young we are or how old we are. If we are Christians, we all have a responsibility. And there is enough room for everybody to work. Sometimes there's a lot of work going on and people say, well, this person's doing this and this person's doing that. There's really nothing for me to do. I'm sorry, but that's an unbiblical thought, because Jesus says there is room for everybody to do something, right? And what ends up happening a lot of the times, and especially teachers will know this, just taking that idea, you fill the role of teaching, kids on Sunday morning or Wednesday night, and there may be someone in the congregation who wants to do that, but they say, oh, well, Peggy's doing this, or the other Peggy's doing this, or Sharon's doing this, so I'm not going to do it. But then that person is no longer in that role for whatever reason, and now there's a void there. There is a role for everyone in God's kingdom, even if it includes assisting someone in the role that they are in. By the way, we're also looking for greeters and people for lockup duty. Just want to slide that in there, all right? And he says, and you know the way where I'm going, there in verse 4. Now that could be taken as a question. Just on the language, do you know the way to the place where I'm going? Now, whether or not he's asking a question, it really doesn't matter, because he seems to be alluding to his earlier teaching about being the gate, whom the sheep, they're going to go in, they're going to go out, and they're going to find, pasture. There in chapter 10 and verse 9, I am the door, by me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved and shall go in and out and find pasture. Chapter 10 and verse 9. Now, if that's what he's alluding to, that he is the way, then the disciples miss it. Because all of the teachings have really kind of been confusing to them. Over in chapter 16 and verse 25, in speaking of his teachings to the disciples, he says, these things have I spoken unto you in Proverbs, but the time cometh when I shall no more speak unto you in Proverbs, but I will show you plainly of the Father. So they've been confused. And we think about the parables or the proverbs that he's been talking about. And what's the one thing we notice about the disciples after he's given a parable? What do they always ask for?
What's that mean?
Yeah, they're always asking for an explanation. It's completely confusing to them. And so if he is talking about him being the way and him being the gate that the sheep are going through, then they completely miss it. But he's walking them through this process of understanding so that the Spirit's going to be able to unpack it for them later. You might want to write down chapter 14, verse 26. But the Comforter, which is the Holy Ghost, whom the Father will send in my name, he shall teach you all things and bring all things to your remembrance, whatsoever I have said to you. So, he's given them these very anxious things. I'm going to be taken away. I'm going to be killed. You're going to deny me. One of you is going to betray me. You're going to be scattered after this happens. So they get really anxious. And he says, but, you believe in me. And then he starts doing this comforter talk. He's kind of preparing them for someone else to come. Sometimes if you're reading theology books, you might come across the word paraclete. Paraclete, Paracleat. Sometimes it's got an E in there. So para, like parachute, and then cleat, Cleat. In Christian theology, that's just referencing an advocate or a helper or a comforter. Generally referring to the Holy Spirit. And I say that because probably be talking about it a little bit, but paraclete, so just think advocate or comforter. But he's unpacking this, and the statement or the question, depending on how you look at verse 4, it triggers the next question by a disciple, and that leads Jesus to kind of further develop the thoughts that he's already expressed in a condensed idea. So he's given this real condensed teaching, and then we're going to get another question, and he's going to expand on that. And it's very much what he's done before. Remember, he's told people one thing, and they didn't get it, so he rephrases it, and then they still didn't get it, so he rephrases it again. Time and again. So he's doing that here is kind of, okay, in a nutshell, this is the teaching. Okay, I don't understand that teaching. Okay, so we're going to expand it a little bit more. Now, some manuscripts actually give a longer reading of verse 4. It's that longer reading is, you know the place where I am going, and you know the way. Which kind of gives a little bit of a smoother transition over there to verse 5. But before we get to verses 5 through 7, did anybody have anything so far, comments or questions? Yes, sir.
These men had been with him during his ministry. They've heard everything he's got to say. I can't help but believe they're a little bit dull. He says you know the way. They do. They've been taught.
Yeah.
But they're not getting it.
They're not.
It's not, because it's not the norm. It's not normal.
Absolutely.
It's something that's going to occur that never has occurred before and won't occur again.
And one of the things that we have to remember too is that they're going not just off of the Torah, not just the first 5 books of the Bible that Moses wrote, but they're also going through all of these, like he says in Matthew 15 and verse 9, they teach his doctrines, the commandments of men. There's been those 400 silent years between Malachi and Matthew where a lot of those traditions and what have you have come up. So they're having to deal with that. But absolutely, it is something that's never happened before. And if we look over, and I reference this verse a lot because it really kind of gives their mindset. In Acts chapter 1, They are they're recalling this conversation, I guess, that they had with Christ. And in verse 6 it says, when they therefore were come together, they asked of him, saying, Lord, wilt thou at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? Because remember, they were thinking a military leader. That's, that he was going to cast off Roman rule. The kingdom, it was going to be restored back to Israel. They looked at themselves, even though they were occupying Jerusalem and other areas, they looked at themselves as an occupied people, kind of strangers in a strange land, that it was not their own, almost as when they were carried off to either Egyptian captivity or Babylonian or Assyrian or what have you. So they don't get it. You're absolutely right. But the one thing that we also have to remember is we have this complete revelation of God that tells us things that at the time they did not know, And the only reason that we know them is because the Comforter came later and taught them everything. Or if you're like Paul, who was an apostle called out of season, he spends 3 years in Arabia being taught by the Spirit. It's kind of interesting that the equivalent of Paul's teaching was also the equivalent of Christ's ministry. Almost as though he were getting, a day every day in that. So, but yeah, and I honestly don't know how I would feel. If I would be shocked and confused if there were someone who I were extremely close to, someone that I shared almost every meal with, probably, someone that we slept in the same house, or same field or tent or whatever for 3 years, and then all of a sudden, I'm going to die. One of y'all is going to betray me. You're going to deny me. Y'all are going to be scattered. I don't know what I'd think, honestly. I'd probably be completely confused and preoccupied, and not thinking about what he taught me a couple of days or a couple of weeks or what have you before. I'd be thinking, kind of the here and now, the immediate. But yeah, not getting it for one way or another, or for one reason or another. Any other thoughts or comments, though? Okay. So verses 5 through 7, Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you're going. How do we know the way? And Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you know him and have seen him. So Jesus, he's spoken of going to his Father's house, and he said that the disciples know the way there, verses 1 through 4. Thomas speaks up for all the disciples and says, we don't know where you're going. Basically, we don't know where you're going, and if we don't know where you're going, how are we going to know the way? Right? And really that's the response of a disciple. He's not demanding anything. It's a sincere question. He's not saying, tell me the way. He's saying, we don't know where you're going. How do we know the way? Right? And it conveys this humility. He's honest, really. He's kind of admitting his ignorance. To say, I don't get it. Like you were saying, he doesn't get it. They don't get it. Thomas is admitting that. He is humbling himself and saying, how do we know the way? And without that type of humility in admitting that we don't know sometimes, or that we don't have the answers, that's a mark of a disciple. And that speaks really a lot to religious people, especially religious leaders, who they can have someone ask them a question. They don't know the answer, but what do a lot of people do? Or what do many, not a lot, maybe, semantics, but what do many of them do, even if they don't know the answer?
Make one up.
Yeah, they'll make one up because they don't want to seem ignorant, or they don't want to seem like they don't know. Instead of humbling themselves and just saying, you know what, I don't know. Let me look at the Bible. Let me research it a little bit more and get back to you. And some of the time, that's because people aren't willing to wait either. Some people don't want to wait for an answer. They want something right then and there. I know Mike said that he didn't know, but I'm not willing to wait until next Wednesday or next Sunday or something for that man to come up with an answer. I need to know right now. And let's face it, people most of the time have gone a few days at least, a few weeks, a few months, maybe even years before getting an answer to that question. What is waiting a couple more days going to do? Absolutely nothing except get them, a true biblical response. But that also speaks to us in a personal evangelism sense. If you're studying with someone and you don't know the answer, don't make one up. Write down the question, or better yet, it's always better if you study, if you're having a Bible study with someone, if you have a second person there with you, that way they can write down the questions that the person is asking instead of you having to pause, and do that. But that's going to show that you're the type of person who you're not going to make something up, that you truly are interested in what God has to say about the matter. And that's why it's a mark of a disciple, because you're not seeking your own understanding. Because what's the Bible say about our own understanding? Do not what?
Don't lean on it.
Yeah, don't lean on your own understanding. It's like you're going to seek the Word of God. Thomas, he seems to understand at least a little bit Jesus' reference to his Father's house on a kind of this world, physical, materialistic level. Which makes sense because, again, it hadn't been too long since they were around the temple. And it's not unlike the way that other people understand in this gospel. Like the woman in Samaria, for example, in John chapter 4, in talking about the water. Give me this water. And I'm the living water. Thomas says, in effect, that we don't know the address. And if I don't know the address, then how is it that I know the route?
Can't put it in my GPS.
Right. Google Maps is not helping me in Jerusalem. Right? I don't know the destination, so I can't put it in there. Now, Jesus, he condemned the Jewish opponents' ignorance of the destination. Like, for example, back in chapter 8, John chapter 8, starting in verse 19, then they said unto him, where is thy Father? Jesus answered, ye neither know me nor my Father. If ye had known me, you would have known my Father also. So he condemned, and it goes through verse 27? Yeah, around 27, John 8. So he condemned them, their ignorance. But because these disciples have been loyal to Christ, they've submitted themselves to him, they've shown themselves to be true disciples. Remember, Judas is gone. His response is encouraging. He doesn't lash out at Thomas. He doesn't demean him for not knowing the answer. He's very patient with them. And so he expands. So he gave this concise view, and he's starting to unpack it slowly. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father. So he's expanding it. And you might also considering noting these following verses. I'll just give you the references, and you can read them sometime this week. These are references for either Jesus or Christianity being known as the way. Okay? Because originally it wasn't known as Christianity. It was known as the way. Acts 9. Verses 1 and 2. That's Acts 9, verses 1 and 2. Acts 19, verse 9. Acts 19 and verse 9. Acts 19, verse 23. Acts 19, 23. Acts 22 and verse 4. Acts 22, verse 4. Acts 24, verse 14. So Acts 24, verse 14. And the last one, Acts 24 and verse 22. Acts 24, 22. Anybody need me to repeat any of those? Okay. Again, those are references to either Christ or Christianity as being the way. Which great references to put down here of Christ saying, I am the way. I am the truth and the life. We have to remember that Christians, by much of the world, before they were called Christians at Antioch, they were called atheists. Atheist did not mean one who does not believe in God. It was a theist, someone who believes in God. One of those things, culture changes all things, right? Could you imagine going up to someone today and saying, you want to have a Bible study with me? Sure. What church do you go to? Oh, I'm atheist. Really? You know? Yeah. And Catholic, by the way, in Latin means universal, and the Church of Christ is universal. So you could also go and say, hey, you want to study with someone? I'm part of the Catholic Church. That works too. Anyhow, any thoughts or comments so far? Yes, sir.
You spoke about the confusion.
Mm-hmm.
In the Gospels, there are some things that, for instance, Jesus' death, we know the timeline in the four Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
But in Matthew 16, when he told Peter he is the rock, that had to have been confusing to him.
Sure.
What is the timeline? I can't figure it out when in his ministry, and there's some clues, but I can't put it together.
Like, you mean how far before the crucifixion was the confession? Or what do you mean?
He told them things, other things that confused him, like that someone would betray him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he also told the disciples in Matthew, but is that the same time period? You look confused.
I'm trying to reorder the question in my head.
Okay, he told Peter,
Uh-huh.
you are Peter, that you're the rock upon which I will build my church. That had to have been somewhat confusing to Peter.
Sure.
And to all the disciples.
Sure.
But I don't know how that ties into the other things. Was it along the same time that he told them that he would be betrayed and that he would go to a place to prepare?
Well, as far as we know, the place being prepared, this is after, Judas has left. Right? So they're at the Last Supper and all of this. So this would have been definitely before that. But as far as how far before, this Last Supper, that we don't know.
Well, we have some clues.
Right, but I mean, to be able to say...
About him going to Capernaum, I think.
Yeah.
So, there's some clues, but I still can't get...
Well, and the difficulty is also somewhat in the calendar, because a lot of the time when we look at the calendar, we look at, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. And most people mark Jesus' birth, a lot of people, not most, but a lot of people mark Jesus' birth at year 0. But actually, when we look at the historical record, Christ was probably born in either somewhere between 4 and 6 AD. He actually wasn't born year 0. What we have to do, and that's kind of a whole lesson on its own, because what we have to do is look at the timeline of Herod and his family, the building of the temple, and other historical things surrounding that based off of what was going on. So, and that's one of the reasons why there's so much, or there's such a gap when you look at like Paul's ministry. There are certain things we can point to, like the Jews being cast out of Rome, for example, because we have other historical data to back that up of when they were persecuted. But then some things you might, Paul traveled here between this year and this year. And part of the reason being is because of the way that the calendar actually is. And it even started before that whole year 0 thing. In fact, one of the things that I wanted us to do, January, February or something, I'll just mention it now, was to have a movie night. There's a documentary on the Exodus and the timeline, and in how the timeline actually should line up to show biblical events and where they actually are in history. But anyhow, that's part of it. So we have some idea, but to be able to narrow it down as to, a few months or even, a year or so, that is pretty difficult to do. We know that it was before this, Yeah.
So this isn't the first confusing thing he has said.
Oh, no, this right here or the confession? No, he's been confusing the entire time. I mean, really, because, he says there in chapter 16, that I've spoken these things in parables to you. And everything was confusing because they always asked afterwards, what does this mean? Or explain this to me. Just like they were probably a little bit confused when he started braiding a whip and going after people at the temple talking about my Father's house. So he was an enigma. He was a little confusing, for sure.
Because we were trying to put him in a human
Right.
picture
Instead of a spiritual one. Because remember, if you think back to when we were looking at earlier chapters, there were some people saying that he couldn't be the Messiah because we know where he comes from. Then there were some saying he can't be the Messiah because we don't know where he comes from. Or they were talking about him casting out demons by the power of demons and all of this. They were wrong on so many levels. Really, what's amazing is that this guy, Jesus, shows up out of nowhere and gets people to follow him, period. And I say that because, imagine, and we've kind of been talking about it in a roundabout way in the sermons on Sunday mornings. He comes out, can anything good come out of Nazareth? But he shows up and it's, hey, follow me. Okay.
He said that to me, I would.
And so, it is somewhat surprising that anybody would follow him to begin with, just in lack of reputation and, lack of money and everything else. That in itself is a miracle. But anyhow, to get back to what you were saying, we know that it was before. We have some general clue, but not much more than that. That probably didn't answer your question at all, but hey, at least I wasn't making up an answer. Any thoughts or other comments, though? Yes, sir.
It's an encyclopedia, and I forget where I got it, but it's called The Timetables of History. And not only does it have Old Testament in one column, New Testament? These are the events that happened in this year. And next to that one, I think it's got one that says what was happening in philosophy, what was happening in literature, what was happening in world history. So it might help put some of that in an order. And there's also a book, I don't remember the name of it, I think Barry may have it. It's just a fold-out chart.
Oh, yeah.
Some of those are pretty good.
Yeah.
But this thing's about 500 or 600 pages.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to put a bunch of different, schools of thought together,
Yeah.
or a bunch of subjects together, that timetables of history is pretty good.
Write that down. That's good because I don't do books with words.
Makes it easier to understand.
So after Jesus, saying this there, or if you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From henceforth you know him and have seen him. So Philip says there in verse 8, Lord, show us the Father, and it's enough for us. So the focus now moves to Philip, and he was introduced earlier back in John chapter 1, verses 43 through 48. Jesus finding Philip, Philip finding Nathanael, and what have you. But he was introduced there, being from Bethsaida, and who was responsible for bringing Nathanael to Jesus. He appears in chapter 6, verses 5 through 7. Offering kind of this probability of being able to feed people. When Jesus lifted up his eyes, saw a great company came unto him. He saith unto Philip, when shall we buy bread that these may eat? And this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them. So he shows up there. And then he's found in chapter 12 and verse 20 and following at the entry into Jerusalem to help the Greeks in trying to see Jesus. So practical Philip is what he's called. And he's presented here as trying to figure out or trying to make sense of what really must have seemed just crazy of Jesus talking about himself and God. So he asked Jesus, he asked him to get practical. Lord, show us the Father and it's enough. And if Jesus had done that, so we've got Thomas, there's some debate, and then Philip, he's practical, just kind of going to lay it on the line. We might say, instead of all this talk that no one's getting, you just show us the Father, and that'll be enough for us. If Jesus just does that, then they don't really have to continue the conversation anymore. It'd be over and done with. And they're easy to understand because they represent this kind of longing in people to have a firsthand experience. You hear about amazing things or wonderful things to happen to other people or what have you, but you don't want that second or third hand. You want it firsthand knowledge. And that's really what Philip's looking for here. The problem is that he didn't realize what he was asking. He asked to see the Father, to see God. And in several places in the Old Testament, it does say that people saw God, like Exodus 24. You might want to write down Exodus 24, verses 9 through 11. That's where Moses, Aaron, and the leaders of Israel, they saw God and they were eating and drinking and what have you. Also Isaiah 33 and verse 20. But for the most part, Israel took very seriously, I think it's Exodus 33 and verse 20. I think it's Exodus 33 and verse 20. Don't write it down yet. Because if you're like me, you hate having to scribble out a note or something just to rewrite it. 33 and verse 20. You can't see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. They took that very seriously. Gideon was convinced that he was in great danger because he had seen the angel of the Lord who was identified with God. He begged there in Judges 6 and verse 18 for the angel not to leave him until he had prepared an appropriate offering. Isaiah was sure in Isaiah 6. Bless you. So, at one level, Philip and the others truly do know Jesus. And so in the Son, they have seen the Father. All right, but they don't recognize that yet. And so as highly as they think of Jesus, they don't yet grasp the fact that God has made himself Jesus. Remember John 1 and verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So they kind of get it, they kind of don't a little bit. But any thoughts or comments so far? And the seeing God, depending on the context of where you're looking, it's not looking on God's face. For example, even Moses desired to do that. God said, you can't look at me, but, I will cover you. Put him in the cleft of the rock, covered him with his hand, so as he's walking away, he could see, as the King James says, his hind parts or his back as he's walking away. And even just seeing that of God, when Moses came down off the mount, his face shone so brightly that it had to be covered with a veil, and the people didn't even want to look at him, So just imagine seeing the face of God. That's not going to work out for you. If you remember Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, they open up the ark and they're just kind of blown away there. Yeah, that's it. That's looking at God right there. If you're just going to radiate with God's glory, looking at him walking away, yeah. So it's generally seen as a theophany. A theophany being a physical manifestation representing God. The burning bush, for example, is a theophany. The pillar of fire or smoke or what have you, being in the presence of God, or an angel of the Lord representing God. Many times in the Old Testament, we have that the angel of the Lord is actually Christ in the Old Testament. But there in verse 9, Jesus says to him, have I been so long with you, and yet you've not come to know me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? So Jesus' question, it's really got a little bit of sadness to it. If his opponents don't recognize who he is, then it's because they've not been taught by God. They have not listened. And if you remember back in chapter 6 and verse 45 of John, the reason is, it is written in the prophets, and they shall be all taught of God. Every man therefore that hath heard and hath learned of the Father cometh unto me. Not that any man hath seen the Father, save he which is of God. He has seen the Father. The only person that's seen God is he who is of God, which is Christ, right? And so they didn't the reason that his opponents didn't see God, didn't see the Father, is because they weren't taught by the Father. They were, if you remember, of their father, the devil, right? And they weren't listening for God. If those closest to him, though, Philip and Thomas and the others, if they still display this similar ignorance to who Jesus is, despite their loyalty to him, they still have this spiritual blindness. Even with being with Jesus for such a long time, that doesn't guarantee the deepest insight, right? They had been with Jesus through all of these things, walking on water, feeding thousands of people, raising Lazarus, the paralytic, the blind man, all of these things and more. Because remember, John is also going to write later, truly Jesus did many other signs that are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe, and believing you might have eternal life. Even if they're having that close of a relationship and yet they are still spiritually ignorant and have to ask that question. And so there's got to be a little bit of sadness there. So we might look at it this way, the length of someone being in Christ does not always give the deepest insight. Paul might say it this way, some of you ought to be teachers by now, right? There can be someone who's been a Christian for 60 years and not know a lick of Bible. It does not matter how long someone has been a Christian. That does not guarantee that they have any biblical knowledge or have any type of relationship with Christ. That's not what guarantees it. I've known people who have been a Christian for a year and can quote more scripture than someone who's been a member for 20 years. And I know that y'all probably have known some people like that too, who have just this sincere zeal for God. So there's a little bit of sadness here in what Christ is saying. I expect it from these fools over here. They weren't taught of God. They're ignorant. They're of their father, the devil. But Philip, how long have I been with you and you don't know me? Really? That is sad.
But it also gives you comfort when you read Psalms 103, verse 14, because it says, for he knows how we are formed. He remembers that we are dust. So there's very low expectancy.
Yeah. We don't remember that we're dust, but God does, right?
But, when you just have to, I just feel like they need to be cut some slack because
Sure.
I feel like I would have been right there with them. I mean, if you haven't seen it before, you didn't know what he's talking about. It's like they were all ready for the kingdom on this earth.
No, absolutely. And I completely agree with you. They did not have the benefit of what we have now.
Yeah.
And the Spirit had not yet come.
Yeah.
So they don't have that Spirit yet to teach them all things. But, do what?
They probably all clicked when the Spirit came.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The Spirit's going to teach them all things. But he's getting into these two verses, 10 and 11. So think of this sadness, okay? Have I been with you so long and you don't know me? Do you not believe that I'm in the Father and that the Father's in me? The words that I say to you, I don't speak them of my own initiative, but the Father abiding in me does his works. Believe me that I am the Father and the Father is in me. Otherwise, believe because of the works themselves, right? So there's a little bit of sadness in there, and then it's kind of for the disciples to ask to see the Father in the presence of Christ. That was kind of a serious problem, because at this point Philip, he's kind of speaking up for all of them when he's saying that show us the way. We don't know. This is a group mentality. right? That they don't understand. And so Jesus here in John, he identifies the problem is that they didn't believe. Paul would have called it like a problem or a crisis of faith, right? So Jesus asks them a follow-up question in verse 10 and then challenges them in verse 11. So verse 10, that question, do you not believe that I'm in the Father and the Father is in me? And then the challenge, verse 11, believe me that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. Otherwise, believe the works. So the works, the miracles that Jesus did in reality are the works of the Father. And he's talked to them about that before. If we think back to John chapter 5 about the witnesses, Jesus talked about the Father bearing witness, Moses bearing witness, the Scriptures bearing witness. One of those witnesses was the works that he was doing, right? And so Jesus, he's telling them, if you have difficulty understanding what I'm saying, if you can't follow along with the words, then just look at the works that I'm doing, because those works testify about me. Because you also have to remember Jesus, them talking about him casting out demons by the power of demons or by Beelzebub, or Beelzebubba if he's from the South. He's talking about a house divided against itself cannot stand, right? Jesus earlier, he offered the same pattern of testing his works to the Jews who were ready to stone him. Back in chapter 10, verses 37 and 38, if I do not the works of my Father, believe me not, or don't believe me. But if I do, though you believe not me, believe the works, that you may know and believe that the Father is in me and I am in him. So that was chapter 10, verses 37 and 38. So he said this same thing before. So even if people don't believe the words that are coming out of his mouth, then they just need to look at the works that he's doing. Any closing thoughts or comments? Okay. We're going to go ahead and stop it there, one, because it's time. But we'll pick up with verse 12 and read over 12, and I'd say at least... Well, 12 through at least 15. I know it's only, 3 or 4 verses. Y'all thought I was going to say to the end of the book or something, right? Just read that a couple of times and just really kind of meditate on those thoughts, because when we pick that up next week, and here's why. Because there's a misunderstanding with these verses when Jesus is saying, the works that I do, you're going to do. And the works that I do, you're going to do even greater works than these. That's what he's saying there in verse 12. So I want to stop there so we can spend a decent amount of time on that next week. Any closing thoughts or comments?